I don't know if you looked at or referenced this picture at all. What's this showing?
Polar ice cap.
Oh,
Yeah.
big. It's decreased.
Yeah, so that's a pretty sizable difference, right?
It doesn't look very promising.
Yeah. And this is an example of a positive feedback loop, which we'll talk about when we get to it. But it's an example of a positive feedback loop. Okay, so things that you should know. You need to know the difference between weather and climate. We talked about that already. It was bell work last week, but that's described right here. Right here with an R. So weather is short term. It's local patterns of temperature and moisture. The moisture generally means there's precipitation involved. That could be snow or rain. Okay. Climate is a long-term view of temperature and precipitation. So generally for climate, we really need more than a year. When we talk about climate, people tend to look at, or scientists tend to look at, like 3 or 5 years of data all at once. But we're seeing that that's shifting and changing. So that's part of what the end of this chapter is about, is climate change. You should also be able to describe Earth's early atmosphere, and then in general, what events changed that. So that's discussed starting here under the next page. So the early atmosphere is hydrogen and helium, really lightweight gases. And then over time, a lot of different things were added through volcanic emissions. So we're talking about carbon and nitrogen, oxygen, sulfur, a bunch of other elements that are in trace amounts, which means small amounts. But lots of volcanic eruptions helped release those. So they were underground below the crust, and then they were emitted onto the Earth's surface and into the atmosphere. And then most of the oxygen that's in the air, that's actually O2 as a gas, was produced through photosynthesis. So before photosynthesis started occurring, there really wasn't much oxygen around.
Can I have Kane, Will Hyde Love to the attendance office?
A brief break brought to you by the front office. Okay, I said a brief break brought to you by the front office. Since the video is still running, I don't want to pause it and then have it go again. So you should know the definition for aerosols. An aerosol is a small particle or a drop of liquid that's been sprayed into the air. So air freshener is an aerosol, okay? And aerosols can help or hinder, I guess, depending on how you want to look at it, the absorption of energy. So if there are things suspended in the air besides gases, then that can absorb or reflect energy depending on what the aerosol is. You should know the layers of the atmosphere, so that's this beautiful, wonderful graph. And you should know some of the general characteristics of them. So before we talk about those, I want to reference this. You should know the main parts of the atmosphere. That was bell work last week too. So that's kind of this. So in general, nitrogen, oxygen, and some of the others. Nitrogen and oxygen are the two big ones though, because that makes up like 99% of the air. Okay. You again should know the layers of the atmosphere and where the temperature differences are. So those temperature differences are due to the fact that different parts of what's in those layers absorbs the energy differently. So that's energy from the sun, and based on how it absorbs that energy or reflects the energy back towards the earth, you get different temperatures. So the first layer, closest to the earth, so the lowest layer, is the troposphere. The air is always moving because it's distributing heat and water. And that movement occurs through convection currents. Another characteristic is that as your altitude increases, the temperature gets lower. Or the temperature gets lower as the altitude increases, depending on which way you want to word that, same thing. You probably have experienced that if you've been anywhere with a mountain. The top of the mountain's colder than the bottom of the mountain. Okay. The second layer is the stratosphere. There's almost no water in that layer, but there's a ton of ozone. So the ozone layer that we talk about giving protection to the earth is in the stratosphere. You need to know why that's important. Essentially, stratospheric ozone, so the ozone in the stratosphere is important because it absorbs and reflects the UV radiation that comes from the sun that would be harmful if it did come through. So that ozone layer is protective for us, for the crops that we plant, for animals that get raised. If that UV radiation did come through, it would damage crops, it would cause mutations in our skin and in our bodies, so we'd have more cancer, other things like that. That's one reason why sun tanning is a bad idea, according to all the doctors, because some radiation still gets through, and it's that radiation, the UV radiation that gets through, that actually changes your DNA and causes mutations that causes you to get cancer. So if you're sunbathing, you're out in the sun more often, you're exposing yourself to that. It's kind of like smoking cigarettes. You expose yourself to something that's known to cause cancer, you're more likely to get cancer. Okay. So with the stratosphere, the temperature is actually increasing. And the reason for that is that there aren't convection currents in the stratosphere. So the warm air actually is above the cold air. So it's a relatively stable temperature. It just gets warmer as it goes because the warm air is higher than the colder air. Okay. The third layer is the mesosphere, and as you go up, the temperature decreases. That's really the biggest thing to know about that layer. There's not a whole lot going on there, nothing really special. The thermosphere, again, though, has some interesting stuff in it, specifically the ions. When the ions absorb radiation the right way, they glow. So this is where the auroras are. There's the aurora borealis, and then the aurora, I think that's australis, I want to say? Yeah, australis. So northern and southern lights. That's because ions, again, absorb the energy, and then they glow when they give off that energy. Okay. This page in general talks about insolation and albedo. We defined those on Friday, so that should sound familiar. In general, you should be able to tell what kinds of things have a higher albedo than others. So snow, high or low albedo? High albedo, because it reflects a lot. Okay, so albedo is a measure of reflectivity. What about clouds?
Light can get through.
It depends on the type of cloud. If it's dense, then it's a high albedo.
Yeah.
But if it's a low density cloud, more stuff is going to get through because it's not as dense, it's not as thick. Okay. Sand. Low compared to some other things. Okay. On the chart, what has the lowest albedo? Black soil. Okay, so remember the color black means that it's absorbing most of the energy, so it's not reflecting a whole lot. Notice water's on here twice though. So when there's low sun, that has a pretty high albedo, but if it's with the sun overhead, that's a really low albedo. So where's the sun most directly overhead most of the time? At noon, okay, but also the equator. So at the equator, where the sun is directly overhead all the time, pretty much every day, the water is absorbing a lot of heat. So water is very good at absorbing the sunlight. It doesn't reflect a whole lot, which means that as more water is exposed over the poles, that causes the water to absorb more energy, so it gets warmer. The warmer water causes more ice to melt, which causes more water to be open at the poles, which then causes it to absorb more energy, so it gets warmer, so more ice melts, so it absorbs more. Okay, so that's an example of a positive feedback loop, where what is happening causes it to happen more. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, positive feedback loop. That's described here. That's a good example of one that I think is fairly easy to remember, so you could give that as an example of a positive feedback loop. I don't know if it would count if you gave that example for the AP Biology exam, but sometimes you might be asked to explain the difference between a positive and negative feedback loop and then give examples. This is a perfectly viable example, but it's not really biology related. Okay, what's what? A negative feedback loop is where something is occurring and happening, but the product or the result of that causes it to stop. So good examples of that usually involve making different things. So different chemical pathways in the body are shut off once you make enough of the product. So a good example of that is ATP. Your body could make ATP all day long, but it doesn't need that ATP because remember ATP doesn't store energy well. So in the pathway to make ATP, once you get enough ATP and there's a lot of that around, that turns off the pathway to make ATP. Okay, so it's kind of a supply-demand thing. As you get enough of it to meet the supply, then you stop making it. Yeah, that's a negative feedback loop. Positive feedback loop is the other way around. In biology, a good example of a positive feedback loop is actually pregnancy. So when a woman gets pregnant, the hormones that control kind of the cycle increase, and they just keep increasing until the end of the pregnancy. Positive feedback loop. Okay. Let's see, what else should you know? You should remember we talked about lower quality energy. Eventually, all the energy that is absorbed by different systems gets released, but it's released at a lower quality. Okay, so lower quality means it's dispersed, it's not as concentrated, so it's usually released as heat. Water absorbs well, so it has a low albedo, we talked about that, and then open water at the poles is a positive feedback loop. Questions about those? Does the concept of albedo make sense? Think you got it? Okay. I don't know if you read the caption down here at all, but it talks about kind of some of the math as far as percentages go. So if you look at this diagram, there are numbers next to everything. You don't have to know all of the numbers, but you should be able to talk about some of it in general or know some of the things from this. So for example, things that help radiate heat back to the earth include the convection currents. It includes stuff that's radiated back from the clouds or from the greenhouse effect. Okay, those are some general things that you should know. All right, defining greenhouse gases. So a greenhouse gas is something that is effective at capturing energy. And usually that's energy from the Earth's surface. So we're not talking about capturing energy from the sun. The energy from the sun passes through these gases, but then when it's radiated back from the Earth's surface, it captures that energy and then bounces it back. So it's called a greenhouse effect because it acts like the glass or the panes in the greenhouse by helping trap the heat inside, which is good for us in some ways because it means that we have a warmer temperature than we would otherwise. But as we continue to have more greenhouse gases, that effect is magnified, so then we're causing the temperature to warm up, which causes climate change, and there are probably problems with that. Okay. We talked about some of the greenhouse gases or what they were. Water's one. We don't worry about that one because that's not one that we control. So it's not something that humans have increased the output of unless we've increased other greenhouse gases. So think when people talk about being concerned about greenhouse gases, they're talking about things like carbon dioxide and methane, maybe nitrogen or nitrous oxide, and maybe some of the fluorine gases. One of the greenhouse gases, or one of the gases that has been a problem is chlorofluorocarbon, which is CFC. That's a problem mostly because it interacts with ozone and it breaks the ozone down. So that means the ozone layer is not as thick or is not as big. So there's a hole in the ozone layer that comes and goes with the seasons. But if we produce a bunch of CFCs, we make that hole bigger, and that can be a problem. But there are also some fluorine gases that act as greenhouse gases. You should be able to talk about this figure, so we talked about that as you guys did the bell work. So you should know where the cells are and what direction they move in. When we're talking about the Coriolis effect, the winds or currents tend to move to the right in the northern hemisphere and the south in the southern, the left in the southern hemisphere. So you should know that. And if why these are dry and then these areas have rain, if that doesn't make sense, we'll come back to that in a second. Okay. Do you have questions about these? Not so much. Okie dokie. So here's us coming back to it. Told you we'd come back to it in a second. It's on the next page. So from this page, you should be able to talk about what causes wind and kind of what causes rain. They're the same thing, or they're really closely tied together. And you should be able to explain the Coriolis effect, which is here and then further on. But this figure helps explain and talk about why we get wind and then why we also have rain in certain places. So what happens to warm air? It rises. So if you have things, evaporation taking place in a warm area, and then that air rises, what happens to the gaseous water as the air rises? It gets colder, okay, because the wind or the air that it's in gets colder. So then what happens to the gas? It turns into a liquid. It condenses. Okay, when it condenses, then what forms? What forms before rain? Clouds. Okay, so we get clouds, then we get rain. Okay, you're on a roll. Keep it up. But so it rains right there. So where there is warm, moist air that rises, that then causes rain. Okay, so then that in that area where the air is rising, what's the pressure like? Low pressure.
Down.
Low pressure. So because there's low pressure, that means, and the air is rising, something has to come in to take its place. So this air rises, and air from somewhere else moves in to take its place. That makes sense, right? And if you create a vacuum, something has to fill it. So air is moving in to take its place. The air that's up here has lost all of its water content because the clouds rained, so they emptied themselves. So then the air moves towards a place where there's high pressure. So then that air comes down. As the air comes down and warms up, what happens to any moisture that's in the air? If there was any liquid water left, what happens to it? It evaporates. Okay, so it goes from liquid state back to being a gas. So it dries out, and there's high pressure because the wind is coming down and pushing there. So we get dry, high pressure systems in the desert. And then that air, I keep switching this, sorry. Then the air moves back to the low pressure system. So this is the reason why we get dry air in places at certain spots on the globe, and why we have rain consistently in certain spots on the globe. So wind is caused by pressure differences, and rain is caused partially by the pressure differences as well. We get rain because of low pressure, because the air is rising, because it's warm, and when it rises, then it loses all of its water, so it rains, and then it moves, but there's no water left in it for it to rain. Does that make sense? So compare this to the rain shadow effect. Do you remember what that was?
Yes.
Yes, maybe?
Yeah.
Where's the rain shadow effect take place?
Mountain range.
By a mountain range, by a mountain. So how does that compare to this?
One side's getting all the rain and the other side isn't.
One side gets the rain, the other doesn't. What happens on the side that gets the rain? So air that moves next to the mountain on the side that gets the rain, what happens to that air? It gets pushed up, it cools off because it's rising, so then it rains on that side. By the time the air gets over the mountain, it's lost all of its rain. Okay? So that's why the rain shadow effect takes place. This also kind of helps explain that. Coolio? Could you explain why winds happen now?
Yes.
Could you explain why it rains?
Yeah.
Maybe. I might ask you about that tomorrow. So, okay, you get a chance to put it into words. Okay. We talked about the Coriolis effect a little bit already. So, the Earth spins faster at the equator. Because of that, that means that although the Earth is spinning faster, the wind doesn't keep up with that. So the wind always moves in the same direction in the northern hemisphere and then the southern hemisphere. So in the northern hemisphere, what direction do currents move? They curve to the right. Okay. And the southern hemisphere, it curves to the left. Okay. Thumbs up. There's a thumbs up. There you go. Okay. So as we're going, let me know if you have questions. Okay. One of the reasons that rain is important is because, again, with climate, we know that it comes at specific times of the year. So I've referenced before when we talked about climates, the idea of seasonal rains. So sometimes they're called monsoons. And that's really important for the growing season for some of the crops people grow in the area where monsoons occur. So if the climate is changing and those rains don't occur at the same time, or maybe never occur, then people can't grow the same kinds of crops, and they're not going to have a source of food. That becomes a problem, not just because the weather is changing and the climate is changing, but because it changes whether or not people can survive and live in those areas. So monsoons occur often in India and Bangladesh. They're not the only places where it occur. Seasonal rains do also occur in China and Pakistan. So the seasonal rains are what countries rely on to grow things like rice. Okay, and without those seasonal rains, it's a lot harder to grow those. Frontal systems. Do you know what a frontal system is? No? Okay. So when we're talking about, there's different kinds of fronts. You can have a cold front, you can have a warm front, but it's where you have two different chunks of air that have different temperatures that run into each other. Okay? If they have different temperatures, they have different densities. So they're literally like a different thickness. And when they run into each other, you then have different interactions. It causes different kinds of weather. So weather's more than just what direction is the wind moving. It's also what temperature are the fronts that are moving. So what temperature is that air and how much moisture does it have? So when there's a cold front, cold air is pushing warmer air away. So the cold air is what's moving. Cold air tends to be packed or can be packed more tightly. And because warm air rises, cold air tends to push warm air up out of the way or forward out of the way. So that means that as it pushes that warm air up and out of the way, what's happening to the warm air? As it rises, it cools off, so any moisture in it condenses, so you get formation of clouds. So then what does that cause? Rain. Okay, so that can cause rain. When we have a warm front coming in, that's where you get air that's warmer, which does happen. And because that's warmer than the cold air that it's running into, the warm air slides up over the cold mass. So again, it's running into cold air is in the way, so the warm air climbs up over top of it. What's that cause?
Isn't it just the opposite? Like, does it cause the cold air to warm up?
It doesn't cause the cold air to warm up. The cold air stays lower because it's denser. It's thicker, so the warm air slides up over top.
So wouldn't that make it cold?
It makes the warm air colder, so any moisture that's in it
It's gonna rain?
would have to rain if there's moisture in it. Okay? So cold and warm fronts can both mean that there's rain. It's just what the interaction is different. So in a warm front, you get different shapes of clouds. You don't need to know the different shapes of clouds. You're not going to be asked a question about that, to my knowledge. So this is not something that you need to know with all the different shapes of clouds. If you're interested in it, go for it, because it's interesting to know, but it's not something you have to know. Okay? How are we doing on time? We're going to be called down for the convocation in a minute. You should know in general the difference between a hurricane and a tornado. What's the difference?
Tornadoes happen on land.
Tornadoes, form over land.
Yeah.
Hurricanes form over the ocean. Hurricanes can travel to land. As far as I know, I don't think a tornado's ever traveled over the water. Okay, so I think it only goes one way. You should know how we use ice cores. So in general, ice cores can be used to help date or figure out what the climate used to be like for a couple of reasons. This is probably our
Teachers, please start the
dismissal.
announcement. As we come down for the Veterans Day program, hold your students until after the bell rings for second period, and please come down with your second period class to the gymnasium. Hold the students briefly after the bell, then please come down to the second period class, and with your second period class to the gymnasium. So teachers, if you could please sit with your classes, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
All 5 of you. I got it. So we have another 5 minutes because we're going to go till the bell rings. Chill. Okay, sorry, I just do what, they tell me. I try to do what they tell me. We'll put it that way. Okay. Oh, I have a low battery. Captured on camera for all to see. Okay, so the ice cores can be used a couple of ways. One of them is though when water freezes, it can trap gas in it. So the gas can then be used, if you melt the ice, you can trap the gas and see what the composition of the gas is. So if we go back deep enough into a block of ice, we can see what the atmosphere used to be like 10 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, with some accuracy. There are things that scientists have to do to correct for errors, whether it's measurement errors or instrumentation errors or potentially errors in how the ice formed around the gas. But if we know that the ice is 100 years old, we can figure out what the climate used to be 100 years ago. So ice cores are one source that we use to try to figure out how the climate has changed. We can use other things, but one change that I said we'd talk about is El Nino. So El Nino is also called the Southern Oscillation, so sometimes it's abbreviated ENSO, E-N-S-O. What causes El Nino? It's kind of a trick question because we don't really know. We just know that it's a thing that happens. We don't know exactly what causes it though. That's like the first trick question I think I've asked. Okay, what? Say that again. I can't hear you. God causes it. It's just this time to have an El Nino event. Go. Okay. So we know that El Nino occurs every like 3 to 5 years, but we're not sure why. And in between the El Nino events, sometimes there are smaller changes. So there's this idea of this big change, this big change, but sometimes there are smaller changes in between the big changes. So the big one's called El Nino, the smaller ones are called La Nina. Okay, the name originates from some fishers in Peru because they noticed that every 3 to 5 years they didn't have anything to fish. The grounds that they normally fished were just gone and empty. So this is what the cycle normally looks like. So again, we get the high pressure system, okay, where there's a desert, the trade winds move along the equator, so then we get lots of rain here because there's a low pressure system and the air is warm, so it's rising. And normally this upwelling occurs in this direction. So the upwelling goes along the bottom of the ocean, and then the surface current follows where the trade winds go. But every once in a while that reverses and the current's weaker, so we don't get any upwelling because the trade winds are weaker. So then there's no upwelling. Okay? So when that happens, that's called an El Nino event. Okay? And again, we really don't fully understand why that happens. We just know that it does. But it does have repercussions. So in an El Nino year, there's a jet stream that's normally over Canada, and that changes direction. Rather than traveling over Canada, it comes south across the United States. And that means that we get moist air, so air with a lot of moisture from the Pacific and the Gulf of Mexico, which brings heavier storms across the Midwest. La Nina means that we get hot, dry weather. So sometimes when people talk about like, this is the worst flood in X amount of time, it's during an El Nino year or a La Nina season. Okay, hold on. We're holding for a minute. Okay, that's most of what the rest of the chapter talks about. I think that what's in 15.4 is fairly straightforward. Do you have any questions about the stuff that they're saying can cause climate change that humans do? It's the anthropogenic, so it means it's human caused. Okay, there is evidence in here that they talk about for how we know that it's caused by humans. You should be able to discuss some of this stuff too. Okay, and that's kind of the end of the chapter. Any questions? No?